Hi class, and welcome to my first sort of interactive lecture. I'm going to just sort of talk you through some important points in the text, and whenever I'm done, whenever you're done watching this, feel free to reply with questions you have, send me emails with questions you have. But my hope is that these lectures will sort of serve as a way to, make the text more accessible to you and sort of also serve as a way to have a conversation about the text. So this week we started off by reading Foucault's The History of Sexuality. So Michel Foucault is really one of the more prolific thinkers of the 20th century. He was born in Poitiers, France in 1926, and he was eventually named to the top university post for a French academic at the prestigious Collège de France in Paris. So Foucault radically shifted our understandings of both broad intellectual topics such as history and politics and philosophy and psychology, and he really wrote about everything. And he also carried strong influences regarding issues he considered to be especially important to him, issues of mental illness, prisons, and sexuality. You might have heard of his other books like Discipline and Punish or The History of Madness. He was a really prolific thinker. So, though Foucault was an important political activist who fought for the rights of numerous marginalized groups, we must not forget that his thoughts radically reshaped how we view ourselves as subjects with social, political, and historical situations, right? So Foucault's thing was thinking about us as subjects and sort of how our subjectivity influences us. So the book we're reading for this class, like I said, is The History of Sexuality. In particular, it's Volume 1. So, The History of Sexuality Volume 1 was published in 1981, and it marks the first volume in what was supposed to be Foucault's 4-volume landmark study on the history of sexuality, and how it is that we, as members of the 20th and 21st century, came to be recognized as sexualized subjects. A characterization that is important, historical, and it sort of means that humans weren't always viewed in light of sexual categories and definitions. Volume 1 in particular, the volume we'll be reading, serves as an introduction to Foucault's method. His method is called the genealogical method. We'll talk about that later. It also reintroduces a number of concepts that are paramount to any understanding of Foucault, namely power, discipline, biopolitics, and discourse. Volumes 2 and 3 go on to trace the development of the discourse and conceptions surrounding sexuality from ancient Greece through medieval Christian Europe. Unfortunately, Foucault died in 1984 of AIDS, a time before AIDS was called AIDS, and as a result, he was never able to finish his entire study, so we don't have the 4th volume. The 4th volume was supposed to be this conclusive text that brought the history to the present. Alas, what Foucault left us was an in-depth introduction into how our subjectivity, how we are as people, and modes of being, how we act in the world as humans, are shaped by forces that seek not to repress sexuality, right? Foucault doesn't believe that sexuality is meant to be repressed necessarily, but rather to name, define, and control our sexuality, to make our sexuality productive and useful for economic means. So in the first chapter of The History of Sexuality, Foucault introduces us to the introduction of sexuality as it arises in the Victorian era, right? So the Victorian era is roughly, I would say, 1837 to 1900, 1901. It's this period of about 70 years that's defined by really extravagance and bourgeois spending, manners and mansions and dresses and all these fancy, nice things. As Foucault points out, prior to this era in history, sexuality was not so clearly defined in terms of categories or concepts. This means that concepts such as homosexual, or any number of other sexual perversions that we have concepts for today did not exist prior to roughly 1830, or really 1870, a lot of historians believe. And this isn't to say that men did not have sex with men or women sex with women, or that homosexual acts, as we call them today, didn't exist. Certainly they did. We know this. We know that men were having sex with men throughout history, and women having sex with women throughout history, and people of all sorts of different sexual interests were doing what they do. But prior to this era, we hadn't really categorized these notions. And so what we see in the Victorian era, in particular, is an attempt to define one's subjectivity in terms of sexuality. So in other words, we see the birth of the homosexual and other sexual perversions. But the question is, why then did sexuality really become codified in the 19th century? What about the bourgeois Victorian era, this era of about 70 years in the 1800s, that opened up a demand to define and categorize sex and sexuality. This is sort of the question that Foucault is really setting out to answer. What historically created this situation in which we wanted to define sexuality? So in Chapter 2, Foucault lays out what thinkers in the Marxist and psychoanalysis traditions have called the repressive thesis. This is sort of the title of his whole first section, right? The repressive thesis. And then he wants to systematically show why this thesis is problematic or sort of lacking in clarity. Specifically when we want to try and understand the rise of sexuality and sexualized subjects in the 19th and 20th centuries. So, right, according to the repressive thesis, conversations about sex and sexuality have been silenced. So no one is supposed to talk about sex. No one is certainly supposed to talk about taking part in any sort of number of perverse sex acts, like homosexuality or anything like that. So for Foucault, the repressive thesis is defined by saying that sex is silenced, right? We don't talk about sex. Don't talk about it. And so the repressive thesis really looks at how many sexual activities have been labeled immoral and illicit and relegated to the margins of society. And this thesis claims that this is because society is seeking to repress its own sexuality, right? So the repressive thesis's ultimate argument is we have a lot of immoral and perverse sex acts, like homosexuality, for example, and we silence we silence conversations about those sex acts because we want to repress it. We want to repress sexuality. We don't want to be a sexual people. But this, according to Foucault, misses an extremely important point that lies even more foundationally than theories of repression. So I want to sort of dive into the text a little bit as we progress, just sort of talk about what Foucault is doing here. So if you go to page 34, what Foucault writes is that rather than the uniform concern to hide sex, rather than a general prudishness of language, what distinguishes these last 3 centuries is the variety, the wide dispersion of devices that were invented for speaking about sex, or for having it to be spoken about, for inducing it to speak of itself, for listening, recording, transcribing, and redistributing what is said about it. Around sex, a whole network of varying, specific, and coercive transpositions into discourse. So, right, what Foucault says is, underlying this idea of repression, right, we repress sex, there's a more important idea, which is a conversation about what sex is at its core. And before we can talk about what needs to be repressed, we have to have systems in place that define what sex is, and define what sexuality is, and define what perversion is, and then talk about how we're going to treat these things. So it's not so much that sex has been silenced, it's that there's this whole language and conversation that sort of arises around how we talk about sex and sexuality for Foucault. So the repression thesis misses it a little bit, because the repression thesis wants to say we just don't talk about sex. But Foucault wants to say, no, we talk about sex in order to not talk about sex. So what I mean by that is we create a whole language, whole system of knowledge around what sex is by using medicine and law and mental institutions and prisons and lots of different things to define what sex is and what sex ought not be. Right? Sex, for example, in the Victorian era, shouldn't be homosexual. And if you're a homosexual, you go to the psychiatric institution. You go to the mental hospital to be cured. That's what happened in the Victorian era. And so, right, we define, so what happens is people become defined according to sexuality. Sexuality arises as a sort of way of defining who a person is. So what Foucault points out is what Foucault points out is occurring in this stage of history is a situation in which sexuality is defined in terms of modes of being. And what I mean by modes of being is like how we are in the world, who I am. Like, right, I am Eric, I'm a professor, I'm a philosopher, I'm a man. Like, these are modes of my being. So, right, what happens is sexuality goes from being like me just going out and having sex and having sex acts to being a part of who I am. So from this point on, I am gay or I am straight. And this definition of who I am is done to then make sex more controllable, right? So what are we concerned with in the Victorian era? Well, in the Victorian era, we're dealing with the rise of bourgeois capitalism. And so what we see happening is some very wealthy, powerful bourgeois people wanting to make society more productive. And what's not productive? Well, homosexual sex is not productive, according to bourgeois politics, because it doesn't involve reproduction. So really, for the bourgeoisie, any sex that doesn't involve reproduction is non-productive sex. And what we should be doing as a society is trying to become the ultimate productive force. And this means anything that doesn't produce, anything that doesn't increase wealth, anything that doesn't increase capital, should be done away with. And so we create systems to take non-productive things out of society and put them, and to fix them and to make them productive again. And so, for example, in medicine, let's think about medicine in the 19th century and the early 20th century as it relates to homosexuality. So what happened? You would go get cured. You would go to the mental institution, and doctors would have you confess your illness, homosexuality, and then they would cure you. Or so they say, right? I mean, it doesn't work, right? But I mean, this is the conversation that's going on at this time. And so, what this means is that it's no longer, right, prior to the Victorian era, lots of people were having sex with lots of different people, and that was called an illicit sex act or something like that. But it wasn't until the bourgeois capitalists in the Victorian era wanted to define productive sex as the necessary sex to make society better that sort of these identities got invested with meaning. So the homosexual is defined in order to define modes of being that are non-productive. The homosexual doesn't reproduce, so the homosexual has to be cured in order to then be able to reproduce and be a productive member of bourgeois society, right? So, because the ultimate goal of the Victorian bourgeoisie is to reduce all sex to sex that produces, any sex that doesn't produce is considered perverse. So this is where the definition of perversion comes into. Perversion is related to non-reproductive sex, and it rises out of this bourgeois need to define sex according to reproduction. So you see things like homosexuality, bestiality, and masturbation even, labeled in the medical field and in the legal field as perverse. Right, think about it. So masturbation is a great example. Right? Masturbation was labeled as perverse in the 19th century because it was a non-productive sex act. You were wasting time masturbating when you could be producing things. You could be going to the factory and pushing your button and making stuff. Right? This was the Victorian ideal. So what this means more broadly is that homosexuality came into existence as a means of control, right? Society labeled people as gay in order to control them, to send them to mental hospitals and prisons, to cure them and take them back to their strictly reproductive existence, whatever that means. So what we're talking about here is the idea that the homosexual arises in the 1800s. This idea of homosexuality didn't exist before the 1800s. It's not an ahistorical term. It didn't always exist. It came into existence specifically to control sexuality. Prior to the 1800s, there was no conception of sexuality. Sexuality was an invented discourse, according to Foucault. And what I mean by discourse will become clear. An invented discourse, that means that we invented language that could define things and create categories so we could then control those things in order to make society productive, right? So let's look at a few passages real quick. First, I want to look at page 23. So what we see on page 23 is the first introduction to this idea of discourse. And you really can't talk about Foucault without talking about discourse. So what Foucault tells us on page 23 is this. This is about halfway through the page. This is the essential thing, that Western man has been drawn for 3 centuries to the task of telling everything concerning his sex, that since the classical age there has been a constant optimization and an increasing valorization of the discourse on sex, and that this carefully analytical discourse was meant to yield multiple effects of displacement, intensification, reorientation, and modification of desire itself. Not only were the boundaries of what one could say about sex enlarged and men compelled to hear it said, but more important, discourse was connected to sex by a complex organization with varying effects, by a deployment that cannot be adequately explained merely by referring to it to a law of prohibition. A censorship of sex, there was installed rather an apparatus for producing an ever greater quantity of discourse about sex, capable of functioning and taking effect in its very economy. Now, what is Foucault saying here? What Foucault is saying is that we didn't just, right, so people talked about sex, and they said, they would go to their priest, for example, in the Middle Ages and say, Sir, Father, I have sinned, I had sex with this man, and a man's not supposed to lay with a man, right? They would confess their sins, this idea of confession, they would talk about their sex. And the idea was you talked about your sex in order to be forgiven. But then, as we progress, there's more and more conversation about sex. And so what Foucault points out is that there wasn't a censorship of sex. We created entire apparatuses around sexuality in order to then control it and to fix it and to make people productive. It all goes back to production. What we see here is we want to produce subjects who can be productive members of bourgeois society, right? So when we think about this, we're thinking about power. And you can't think of Foucault without thinking about power. And so what power means to Foucault is that there's a force, a normative force. By normative force, I mean like a custom or a habit or a norm that we all share. And this force imposes itself upon us, and it makes us act a certain way, right? So there's a reason why we don't wear socks on our heads, right? And why we wear socks on our feet. Because there's a norm that dictates how we live and behave. There's a reason why we walk a certain way, or we wear glasses, or, we write in English, right? Or we write in our native language, right? These are all norms that we're trained to act a certain way. So what Foucault says is this power that exists in society in which we belong, is productive. It produces us. So the repressive thesis is a problem because what the repressive thesis says is that power is negative. It silences, right? Power tells us to not talk about sex. But Foucault says, prior to the negative power, there's a productive power. There's a power that produces us as sexualized beings. And in that being produced as sexualized beings, we are either silent, we're silenced if we don't have a strictly reproductive relationship to sex and sexuality. But to do this, we have to have lots of conversations about what sex is. Well, sex is intercourse between a man and a woman with the intent of producing a baby. Sex ought not be intercourse between a man and a man. Sex ought not be oral sex. Sex ought not be masturbation, right? All these things are ways we talk about what sex is not. But we do it by creating a whole system of knowledge around how we define sexuality. And this comes to be through social force, through social power, through norms and custom and culture, right? So the last piece there's a couple more passages I want to talk about. I want to switch over to 24 real quick, because this talks about power a little bit, and then I'll have one more passage to share. So at 24 we see, one had to speak of it as a thing, speak of sex as a thing, to be not simply condemned or tolerated, but managed, inserted into systems of utility, regulated for the greater good of all, made to function according to an optimum. So, right? Like, just to reiterate what I've been saying this whole time, men throughout history have always fucked other men, and women have always fucked other women, but this has always been it's never been defined. But then, as with the rise of the bourgeoisie during the Industrial Revolution, there was this need to eliminate non-productive aspects of life. So what do? We don't just tell people not to have sex. That's not the idea. What we do is we create systems of knowledge. We create categories of what sex is and what sex is not, and what sex is acceptable and what sex is not acceptable. And then those who practice unacceptable sex acts, they become defined according to these labels. Well, you have sex with men, you're homosexual, you need to be cured, we're going to send you to the mental hospital to be cured, and then when you come back, you'll be cured and ready to go, right? So let's go to the last passage. I think this is one of the most important passages. You should underline this if you haven't. It's on page 30. And it's the very last sentence of the half paragraph at the beginning of the page. But this was only the counterpart of other discourses, and perhaps the condition necessary in order for them to function. Discourses that were interlocking, hierarchized, and all highly articulated around a cluster of power relations. Right? So what happens? This is what happens to society. We all relate to each other, and these relations are always relations of power. What this means is that I act a certain way because I belong to a society. I belong to a group, and the group sort of imposes itself on me, and I act that way. Even if I choose to rebel against that group, I'm still acting in relation to that group, right? So that group defines my mode of being. So what happens is, if this group creates discourses or language or knowledge about how we ought to act or what it means to be us, we act according to that. So I act as a sexualized being because I belong to a society that has created concepts and knowledge and systems about what it means to be sexualized and what it means to have a sexuality. It means to be gay, or to be straight, or to be into leather, as we'll read in Gail Rubin, or to be into all these other acts that have been labeled perverse. But my identity is sexualized. I'm a sexual being because of this invention, because knowledge was created about me in order to control me, right? Who I am, because based on my sexual preferences, became who I am, and then society can control me. And this is where we leave off with Foucault for this week. So we'll talk about Rubin later this week. Rubin has a great article on sort of a more practical understanding of thinking sex in terms of American politics, American sociology. It's a really powerful text, and I think it's really important when you start reading Rubin to think about it in terms of the gay liberation movement, right? So when we think about the gay liberation movement, we're thinking about sexual freedom, and this was a real thing that happened in the 70s. Like, people wanted sexual liberation. The question is whether or not that's possible, and we'll talk about that. But in the meantime, we'll finish up Foucault next week. I'm hoping that this sort of lecture helped make Foucault a little bit clearer. If not, let me know. Ask questions, send me emails. Foucault's dense, but I'm more than happy to talk about Foucault. Foucault's my favorite philosopher. He's who I've dedicated my life to studying, so I really want to make him accessible to you. So if you're not understanding something when you're reading Foucault, email me or comment below the video so that we can talk about it, okay? Looking forward to a great summer. Thanks.